This Heroes of Shee'Mah battle report is of a game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles 6th edition. However, it used a feature from Warhammer 3rd edition, a Games Master. The Games Master provided the models and scenario, and educated the rules during the game. The Games Master could also change the rules as he felt appropriate for the situation, though he had to try to be impartial as much as possible. This scenario is called Hell Hath Fury, an original scenario made by the Games Master. It is a small-scale battle of Bretonnians versus Undead. However, the Bretonnian player does not know the true identity of the necromancer at first, and believes they are playing a scenario called A Damsel in Need is a Damsel Indeed. The introduction for the scenario is as follows. Cries of alarm are heard round the Lord's castle. The lady, taken away, kidnapped by the undead this day. The Lady Pompery is the recent widow of the Duke's younger brother. First, her husband was lost in battle, and now she has been abducted by a band of skeletons. Oh, what cruel fate this woman has been given. But Duke Ferdinand d'Albert of Aquitaine cannot leave a woman fair to such a terrible fate, especially not the lady who has fallen under his care since his brother's demise. He musters his troops and mounts his Pegasus, and gives chase to the undead minions, last seen heading towards the mausoleum. The Bretonnian player believes they have 6 turns to save the lady before she is slain. However, as we will soon find out, the lady is the necromancer, with a grudge against the Duke. She aims to reanimate the corpse of her late husband, who is also the Duke's younger brother, and then send her horde to kill the Duke. The armies for this scenario are chosen using the 6th edition Ravening Hordes army lists. The 6th edition Ravening Hordes lists were provided upon release of the 6th edition game as get-you-by army lists, as the new edition had made the old army books obsolete, and players needed rules to use until the new army books were released. The Games Master opted to use these lists as it is his opinion that these lists provide a simpler and more balanced game experience, where unit functionality and flavor is provided by the statistic blocks, equipment rules, and models themselves, rather than by special rules. This is a very grown-yard sensibility, perhaps, but the one that the Games Master has chosen to use. Also, while the undead models being used are largely Tomb King of Khemri proxies, the Games Master has taken a Necromancer and White Hero from the Vampire Counts list for the undead forces. Overall, the Games Master has used the lists for points values for various models, and largely ignored the army construction rules. Each side has roughly 500 points of troops. The Bretonnians are led by Duke Ferdinand, a paladin on a Pegasus with heavy armor, shield, and a lance. A unit of 6 Knights of the Realm with full command provide the central military might to the army. The Bretonnian player also has 2 units of men-at-arms, one armed with spears, light armor, and shields, and the other with longbows. Note that the spearmen proxies are intended to be halberdiers, but the Games Master forgot when he was making the lists and gave them spears instead. For rules purposes, these were treated as spearmen for this game. The Undead began the game with a force that somewhat mirrored the Bretonnians. Instead of heavy cavalry, however, the Undead cavalry were skeleton horse archers. The skeleton force also had a unit of 10 archers, but the main bulk of troops was a block of skeletons with spears, shields, light armor, and full command. Their numbers meant that they would have a lot of staying power on the battlefield, as they would never flee. The Undead also had 2 characters that would come into play once a certain scenario condition was met. One character was Pomperi, a 2nd level necromancer. The other was the raised corpse of the Duke's younger brother, Francois, who is a wight, whose statistics will depend on when a certain scenario condition is met. The battlefield was set up as shown here. The mausoleum sits about midfield, 24 inches from the Bretonnian side, which is the closer side in this picture. The sarcophagi on the battlefield count as difficult terrain, having movement when crossed, though the stone plates around them are considered open ground. Additionally, the hill to the lower right of the picture has a sheer face on the side facing the mausoleum. A games master decided that a unit on this sheer face would be considered defending behind an obstacle if charged, and relayed this information to both the players. The mausoleum is the primary focus at the beginning of this scenario. The Bretonnian forces wish to get to the mausoleum as soon as possible, and the Undead are incentivized to delay the Bretonnians, as the reanimated Francois becomes stronger with each passing turn. However, during this time, the Undead army is without their necromancer, so the scenario rules permit the Undead player to prematurely end the reanimation ritual and bring out the necromancer and white hero early, should they so wish. Players rolled for first turn, with the Undead player winning the roll. The Undead player then deployed their first unit, after which the players alternated deploying units. The Undead deployment zone was limited to being within 12 inches of the mausoleum and behind a line extending parallel to the front, or Bretonnian side, of the mausoleum. The Bretonnian deployment zone was within 8 inches of their table edge, meaning there would be at least 16 inches between any Bretonnian unit and the mausoleum. This was designed to prevent the knights from marching into contact with the mausoleum on the first turn. As with barding, their march move would be 14 inches. Note that the scenario rules do not allow the Pegasus riding paladin to make contact with the mausoleum. This is purely a mechanical consideration to prevent the paladin from moving into contact with the mausoleum on the first turn. Play began with the Undead player, who moved his horse archers and spearmen forward. During the shooting phase, the skeleton archers discovered that while their position on the hill gave good visibility, they were out of range of the Bretonnian line. The horse archers fired their bows at the unit of knights. Having moved and being beyond half range, they needed 7s to hit, which means they needed to roll a 6, followed by a roll of 4 or higher. But no hits were scored. The Bretonnian forces likewise moved forward, with the archers taking position on a hill and the knights daring the horse archers to engage them. The men-at-arms archers fired on the skeleton spear block, reducing their number by 1, but overall, the turn was uneventful. The undead player decided it would be better to charge the knights than to be charged. Most undead units, and skeletons are no exception, cause fear as per the Warhammer psychology rules, and even brave knights of the realm are not immune to these effects. However, the knights passed their fear test and were able to fight in combat normally. Meanwhile, the other undead units crept forward. Unlike most units, undead cannot take advantage of the marching rule to move double. The skeleton archers moved forward on their hill to get into range with their bows. They opened fire on the Bretonnian spearmen. Despite needing 7s to hit, they managed to score 2 hits and 1 wound. But the spearman's shield takes the arrow in his stead, and there is no casualty. Next, during the close combat phase, the skeletons have a good round of combat, with the riders scoring 2 wounds and the horses 1. Mounted knights with full armor and ardent steeds are normally very resilient and save wounds on a roll of 2 or better. But fate was unkind to the Bretonnian player, and 2 saves were failed, resulting in 2 lost knights. However, the knightly counterattack was sound, scoring 3 wounds that the horse archers failed to save with their armor save of 6. And with the knights' bonuses for their banner, extra rank, and outnumbering, the knights won the combat by 5 points. While undead will never break and flee, being defeated in combat disrupts the magical energies that raised them. So instead, they take 1 wound per point they lose combat by. In this case, the loss by 5 points was more than enough to remove the last 2 skeleton riders, and the knights wiped them out. However, considering that 2 of the powerful knights were removed from action, the undead player was more than happy with this trade. The Bretonnian side declared no charges, as the only unit that could have successfully charged was the Duke. But to put him in combat alone would be very risky. So, to prepare for the next round, the Duke moved to the flank of the skeleton spear block, while the men-at-arms spearmen marched forward to keep the battle near the mausoleum. Now unhindered, the unit of knights moved forward and made contact with the mausoleum and rushed in to save Pompeii. During the shooting phase, the archers on the hill fired at the skeleton spearmen, scoring 3 hits that became 2 wounds, which go unsaved to fell 2 skeletons. As the knights enter the mausoleum, they are shocked to discover that the Lady Pompeii is in fact not being abducted, but is instead a necromancer reanimating the corpse of her fallen husband, the Duke's brother Francois. In her monologue, we also learn that the Duke is not without sin, for he sent his younger brother, Pompeii's former husband, off to die in a hopeless battle, all to reduce Pompeii's ability to leverage her marriage to gain political power. It is at this point that the true scenario objective is revealed to the Bretonnian player. He must slay Pompery, as she is dabbling in the dark arts, and furthermore could tarnish the Duke's reputation by telling others of his misdeeds. For this scenario, slaying a character does not just mean to reduce that character to 0 wounds, as a model with 0 wounds can be understood to be merely incapacitated, not necessarily dead. So, the game's master added a stipulation to the scenario rules that not only must the character be reduced to 0 wounds, but to be slain in combat, their side must either flee or be wiped out. And if the character is slain by shooting, a unit must go to the spot where that character lost their last wound to dispatch the character once and for all. From the Undead side, a complete victory would be achieved by slaying Duke Ferdinand in the same manner. Or, if the Bretonnian army flees the table, or if 6 turns elapse, the Undead player can claim a partial victory. But now, the Undead player also gains the Revenant Francois, who is a white hero for rules purposes. Since the ritual was ended early on turn 2, he is at his lowest power level. The game's master allows Francois to deploy, join the skeleton unit, and then join them in declaring a charge on the first turn of his deployment, as the skeletons were already so close to the mausoleum. The skeleton spearmen charged the men-at-arms spearmen, who passed their fear test and stood fast to face the undead throng. Now that there is a wizard on the battlefield, we have our first magic phase. Pompery casts an invocation of Nehek at its 2nd level, rolling 3 power dice to cast the spell. With 2 6s among the results, she casts the spell with irresistible force, and the Bretonnian player cannot even attempt to dispel. This spell can raise 2d6 skeleton warriors when cast at its 2nd level, but the Undead player rolls somewhat poorly, gaining only 4 warriors. The Undead player chose to raise them in between the skeleton spearman's flank and the Pegasus-mounted Duke, in order to prevent a flank charge the next turn. During the shooting phase, the skeleton archers fire on the peasant archers, managing to score 1 hit, which becomes 1 wound. And the archers have no armor, so this results in 1 casualty. During the close combat phase, the skeletons cannot use their spears, as they had moved this turn. And even with the aid of their champion and the Revenant Francois, they only score 3 hits, resulting in 1 wound, which went unsaved. The men-at-arms could strike back with both ranks, as they had not moved that turn, and may bring their spears to bear. But even needing 3s to hit, the dice were unkind, with only 3 hits scored. The spearmen further managed to convert 1 hit to a wound, and the save was failed. But the superior size of the undead unit allowed the skeletons to win the combat 5 points to 3. As the men-at-arms were outnumbered by a fear-causing enemy, they broke automatically and quickly made their way towards the Bretonnian table edge. As the Bretonnians began their third turn, they decided to declare no charges, with their focus being on cutting down Pompery. So, they ignored her minions for now. The Bretonnian men-at-arms failed to rally and continued their flight, though they were still a turn or so away from leaving the battlefield altogether. The knights began to maneuver around the chapel on one side, while the Duke headed to the other side in hopes of pinning Pompery. The Duke was careful to avoid being in the charge arc of the skeleton archers. And as he had plenty of movement with his flying Pegasus, the Bretonnian player declared this intent clearly, and the games master and his opponent all agreed that this positioning achieved that intended goal. While this maneuvering was going on, the Bretonnian archers moved to the edge of the hill to gain defended status, and fired a volley into the oncoming skeleton spearmen. But despite getting 4 hits and 2 wounds, only 1 save was failed. The Undead turn began with the skeleton spearmen declaring a charge on the archers on the hill. The archers, however, failed their fear test and panicked in the face of the skeleton horde that outnumbered them. The Bretonnian player was at this point becoming quite chagrined at the performance of his peasant troops. The skeletons continued to lumber forward after the fleeing archers and began to crest the hill. Meanwhile, fortune continued to frown upon the Bretonnians, as the unit of raised skeletons that the Duke had ignored attempted to charge the flank of the unit of knights, and it was found they were barely in range. While the threat to the knights by these skeletons is not great, the knights were caught out of position, and it would take time for them to unentangle themselves from the raised skeletons. Pompery moved along the back of the mausoleum, out of the Duke's line of sight, and then attempted to bolster the skeleton unit by casting the Invocation of Nehek again. While the spell succeeded, and the Bretonnian player was unable to dispel it, she rolled poorly for the spell results, resulting in only 1 skeleton being added to the unit. In close combat, the skeleton scored a resounding 5 hits on 5 attacks, with 3 wounds and 1 failed save from the knights. The knights and horses completely failed to score any hits on their counterattack, and the combat was a draw. Note that since the knight unit had a musician, they should have won this combat instead, but both the players and the games master forgot about this until later, as this would have removed another skeleton model. A model was removed once the mistake was discovered. At the beginning of the Bretonnian turn, no charges were declared. The spearmen successfully rallied and turned to face the oncoming skeleton horde. But the archers failed to regain their nerve and continued their flight, becoming dangerously close to leaving the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Duke again repositioned himself to attempt to pin down the Necromancer Queen. The close combat between the knights and the skeletons began with the knights hitting only once, but failing to wound, and 1 warhorse scoring a wound only to have it glance off the skeleton's light armor for no casualties. The skeleton's counterattack was somewhat poor as well, scoring only 1 hit and 1 wound. But this time, the knight's armor kept them safe, resulting in a combat with no casualties. However, this round, the static combat resolution bonuses of the knights overcame those of the skeletons, and the knights managed to win the combat by 1 point, causing one skeleton to crumble back into dust, and allowing the knights to reform to face their opponents. While the skeleton spearmen continued to scramble up the hill, and the skeleton archers reformed their unit to get the Duke in their sights, Pompery ran around the corner of the mausoleum to try to avoid the Duke's charge. Originally, the Undead player had wanted to have Pompery march, as independent characters can always march, and place her on the flank arc of the Duke to prevent a charge. However, the game's master ruled that he would let the Duke charge her in this situation. This is contrary to the rulebook. However, the game's master felt that in this case, with no other units nearby, and the Duke already focused on Pompery, that it did not make much sense for the Duke to be unable to charge her. With that ruling being made, the Undead player instead chose to move Pompery around the corner of the building. During the magic phase, Pompery unleashed the Gaze of Nagash on the Duke. The Bretonnian Dispel attempt for this fails, and the magical energy scored 2 wounds on his Pegasus and 1 wound on him, which he failed to save. Both Pegasus and Rider are now at 1 wound each, dangerously close to death. With only 1 power die left to cast a spell, the Undead player decided it would be better used than wasted, and attempts to cast the lowest level of the Invocation of Nehek. The spell succeeded, and the Bretonnian player had no dispel dice left. And with a roll of a 6 on a single die, the Undead player summoned more skeletons with 1 casting of the lowest level than 2 castings of the medium level had provided previously. The Undead player bolstered the unit of raised skeletons in combat with the knights, and created a wall of bone warriors to prevent the Duke from assaulting Pompery. The skeleton archers unleashed a few arrows at the Duke, scoring a hit, but failing to wound, narrowly leaving him in the fight. In close combat, the Bretonnian knights finally showed their mettle, scoring 3 hits with 2 unsaved wounds, and their horses scoring 2 hits with 1 unsaved wound, for a total of 3 casualties. Meanwhile, the skeletons managed only 1 hit, and while it became a wound, the armor of the knights deflected it harmlessly. Combat resolution goes in the favor of the knights, and the skeleton horde is greatly reduced in number. But knowing not fear, nor having any sense of self-preservation, the skeletons continue to fight. The Bretonnian player began turn 5 with a flank charge by the Duke into the raised skeletons, who were in the way of a path to charge Pompery. The men-at-arms spearmen attempted to charge the skeleton spearmen, but they failed their fear check, so had to stay put. Meanwhile, the men-at-arms archers failed to rally and fled from the battlefield. In the ensuing melee, Ferdinand gets 1 hit and 1 wound with his lance, and the blow is so mighty the skeleton's decrepit armor was of no use. The Pegasus further scored 2 hits and 1 wound, and with the last skeleton having failed his armor save, the unit was wiped out. Because the unit was wiped out in the first turn of a charge, Ferdinand may overrun, which allows him to charge into Pompeii. Filled with righteous rage, or a strong desire to put an end to his familial shame, the Duke took the opportunity to overrun into combat with his sister-in-law. Though the fate of each side's spearmen seemed unlikely to tip the scale of the battle, the skeleton spearmen charged into the Bretonnian spearmen, who this time passed their fear check and faced the skeletons in combat. During the magic phase, Pompeii summoned skeletons with a casting roll of 11. The Bretonnian player's dispel roll of 10 was just short of success, allowing the necromancer to summon a bodyguard of 6 skeletons around her. The games master ruled that it made sense to allow her to summon these skeletons as part of a unit with Pompeii in it. The skeleton archers moved forward and fire at the knights, but failed to score any hits. In the spearmen melee, the skeletons and Francois made 7 attacks, scoring an impressive 6 hits, with 2 wounds that went unsaved. The men-at-arms fought back, scoring 6 hits themselves, converting to 3 wounds that were unsaved. However, due to their superior numbers, the skeletons managed to win the combat by 1 point. As they were outnumbered by a fear-causing enemy, the men-at-arms automatically failed their break test and fled off the table, as the skeletons chose not to pursue. Meanwhile, the Duke rained down blows upon Pompeii, scoring 2 hits and confirming 2 wounds. Pompeii was slain, skewered on the Duke's lance. And with the necromancer felled, the raised skeletons and skeleton archers crumbled to dust, with the Bretonnians declaring victory. However, the magic that animated the revenant Francois was strong, and he was able to slink away into the night. As Pompeii breathed her last, she spoke, and was heard across the battlefield, despite her voice being but a whisper. She said, "Oh, Lord Nagash." The scenario ended with a Bretonnian victory. This was the first time this scenario was run, so the games master talked with the players about possible modifications. The Undead player mentioned that it seemed impossible to keep the Bretonnians away from the Massilian, considering the mobility and striking power of the knights, though he wondered if it would have been different if his skeleton spearmen could have deployed across the knights. The games master also wondered if the mobility of the Duke on his Pegasus gave the Bretonnians too much of an advantage when hunting down Pompeii. However, overall, everyone had an enjoyable game, and the games master was pleased that 2 small forces, composed primarily of basic units, with characters with no magic items, provided a simple, though still tactically fulfilling game. And with that, we come to the end. Thank you for watching this battle report from the Heroes of Shee'Mah.